battery looks a little low, so maybe I should talk fast. Yep, now you're good.
Oh, okay. Anybody? Yep. We're on. Okay. All right.
Absolutely.
Well, good evening, everybody. We are glad to have you here on this March comes in or leaves like a lion, I guess, tonight. But we have one more day. Maybe it'll get better or worse. We'll see. Tonight, we welcome you to In the City for Good. And I know I see a lot of fresh faces, and that's great. And we are very thankful that you're here. And even more, we're very thankful that we have our hosts who have graciously given us the opportunity to use this room. And so we will have one of the co-pastors come in, and he's going to introduce himself and give us a few overview things.
Great, thank you, Helen. So I'm Kirkland Reynolds. I'm one of the pastors here at Christ United Methodist Church. Just really want to welcome you to this conversation and forum. Thank you, Dr. Pekel, for your time with us, and thank you, Helen, and everyone from In the City for Good for making this opportunity available. Here at the church, our mission is to be grace in the city, and we really think that part of our mission is lived out by finding ways to have dialogue in the community and to help build relationships so that we can not only build on what is our strengths throughout Rochester, but also continue to find ways to solve all of our great challenges together. So again, want to welcome you. Just so you know, restrooms are up there and to the right. And then we're live streaming this, so you can go to YouTube later today or tomorrow. You can find that at our church's website. You want to find that link so you can watch it or share this conversation with friends. And again, thank you, and welcome.
Thank you. And if those of you in the room have friends who are at home and want to give them the information about the live stream, they can join us at this point too. I'd like to introduce you first of all to In the City for Good, since many of you have not been at any of our meetings before. In 2015, a group of people came together in Rochester, and we're excited about the Destination Medical Center, but also saw a lot of changes that were going to come to Rochester and saw things that needed to be addressed. As a result, In the City for Good became a community organization, kind of a grassroots thing, and it's open to anyone in the city of Rochester. Our goal has been, throughout our history, to be an area where we can communicate and educate the community, all members of Rochester, excuse me, by presenting people who are leaders in government, in schools, throughout the community to keep up to date with things that are happening here. Tonight is the latest of these meetings where we had Dr. Pekel online when he first came because we could not be in person, so we're excited to have him here with us tonight for the first time. Let me introduce you to Dr. Pekel, and I'm going to have to read some of this because there's a lot here. So
you can cut it way down. It's fine.
I did
could
cut
just
it
say
down.
Kent, but okay.
Right. So he has been here as superintendent of schools for a few years. What, 2.5?
Actually, just a year and a half.
Okay. I'm sorry. Just
1 year's interim. So I sort of see this as year one.
That's right. Okay. Yes, right. I know the pandemic kind of messed everybody's timetable up. But throughout his diverse career, he has sought to bridge research, practice, and policy to help all young people thrive and learn and grow. Prior to this position, he spent 9 years as president and CEO of Search Institute up in St. Paul, but he's also held other positions in educational research, including positions in the U.S. Department of Education. Perhaps most important of all to me is that he has been a high school teacher here in Minnesota, his home state, and that is a critically important job. So he has a PhD from the University of Minnesota. He also has degrees from Harvard and Yale. So without further ado, would you share with us your thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. I will just say, as always happens in sanctuaries and classrooms, people sit the furthest, from that, and I I messed it up, but I'm from 4 generations of ministers moving before me, from father. So it's always fun to actually be in a church talking about education, because it kind of feels like a little bit where my paths kind of come together. I look forward to some questions and discussion, including I like the hard questions, but Helen asked me to kind of frame some things and tell you a bit about our strategic plan for Rochester Public Schools. What I actually want to start out with is actually a quote. I was a high school history teacher, and so I'm prone to pull quotes out of the dustbin of history. And the reason I want to inflict one on you right now is actually because I think if you're thinking about making really ambitious change, you need to know not only what you're for and where you want to go, but you actually also need to know what you're, I think it's fair to say, against, or at least trying to leave behind. If you think about all the great social movements, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, they all knew where they wanted to go, but they all were trying to leave something behind. That's also true of organizational change. You know, companies like Apple Computer or Microsoft that are famous for one thing, but then they survive. They're pretty clear we're going from this to this. So one of my jumping off points for this conversation, which I've been having in all of our schools and programs, is what are we actually trying to leave behind? So here's a quote. I'm not multitasking and answering email here. I want to read you the exact quote. I'm not going to tell you who said it, but just kind of listen to it and actually let it sink in a bit. And then I'll tell you who said it and why I think it frames the challenge and opportunity we have in Rochester Public Schools. Quote, "We can picture the educational system," excuse me, I'm going to button my shirt so you don't all have to stare at the button that is. "We can picture the educational system as having a very important function as a selecting agency, a means of selecting the men of best intelligence from the deficient and mediocre. All are poured into the system at the bottom. The incapable are soon rejected or drop out after repeating various grades and pass into the ranks of unskilled labor. The more intelligent, who are to be clerical workers, pass into the high school. The most intelligent enter the universities, whence they are selected for the professions." Now, if we had a lot more time, I might actually put that quote up there and ask you to read and maybe even guess who said it. But in the interest of time, I'll tell you it was written in 1921 in a very prominent journal of the day called Scientific Monthly. And the author was a guy named W.B. Pillsbury, no relation to the Doughboy Pillsburys. He was one of the most prominent educational psychologists of the 20th century. He was a tenured faculty member at the University of Michigan and president of the American Psychological Association, among other august groups. And he was one of a handful of men who really invented the American educational system of the 20th century that replaced the common school or the one-room schoolhouse. And I would submit that the vision of education that was described in his article and in the quote that I read is not entirely ancient history, that in fact there's quite a bit of it that still remains in our schools today. When Pillsbury says the purpose of education is selecting the men of best intelligence, he literally, of course, meant men. He also meant men who looked like I do. He was actually a virulent racist whose writings about essentially breeding people for intelligence were actually read 10 years later by Nazis in Germany as fascism was on the rise. This guy was head of the American Psychological Association. And then the vision of intelligence that is in that quote is one in which intelligence is really a fixed commodity, and either you got it or you don't. And school's job is to figure out who has it, to what degree, and put you on a path. And it's the opposite, actually, what we know today from brain science about how you actually can increase intelligence, that when you challenge yourself intellectually, mentally, you literally create new neural connections in the brain and you literally get smarter, just like when you lift weights, you break down your muscles and you get stronger. But that was a vision in which there's pretty much nothing schools can do to increase human capacity. And our job was just to try to sort of find the diamonds in the rough. It was certainly an era in which the phrase college material was used in quite a literal sense. Some kids were college material and some kids were not. And then finally, that was a vision of education for a low-skill economy. When Pillsbury talks about the people who are poured into the bottom of the system and then the, quote, deficient and mediocre are spat out and work in the unskilled labor, to me at least, that sounds not only unequal but also unethical, but in a very real sense, in that time, that system worked because you actually could support a family with hard work and low skills. And probably many of us have in our own family histories generations that lived the American dream of living better than their parents and grandparents did with hard work and relatively basic academic and other kind of skills that you would learn in school. We know since the 1970s that era is gone, and that if kids have got only low or rudimentary basic skills, their chances of having a family-sustaining wage are next to none. And that is accelerating at breakneck speed as artificial intelligence makes the old automation look quaint and pleasant. And so when I think about what we're trying to leave behind in Rochester Public Schools, it's a vision of education in which, first of all, we believe your demographics determine your destiny and your potential. It's a vision of education in which intelligence or human potential is fixed, and there's not much schools can do to increase it, and their job is to sort it. And it's a vision of education for a low-skill economy in which not many people need to think critically, need to solve problems, need to be able to collaborate at high levels. In Pillsbury's world, that was the men of best intelligence who went to the universities. Today, it's got to be all of our kids. And so the strategic plan that we have embarked on in Rochester Public Schools was developed last year, and it is summarized on this one-pager that you all have right there. The plan itself is 135 pages. It's on our website. It's got lots of charts and graphs and data. If you can't fall asleep at night, you can go download it. It was facilitated by a research organization that's based in St. Paul, Wilder Research. There were 6 working groups comprised of 75 people who gave hours and hours and hours. We also did focus groups and surveys across the city that collectively got the insight of thousands of people from Rochester. And we also dug into the data. We looked at where we are in terms of our student outcomes, our finances, and we looked at research on school systems that improve education for all kids, but especially accelerate learning for the kids who are struggling. And so my goal was to take that 135-page plan and boil it into a single one-pager. And so you can see on one side is a graphic that summarizes the major strategies. There's 15 of them. And on the other side is a single-sentence description of each of the 15. What this doesn't show is that this plan doesn't happen all at once, because if it did, certainly I would explode, and our system probably would. So it's actually staggered over 3 years. This year is year 1, next year is year 2, the following year is year 3. And by the end of that 3 years, the goal, of course, is not to have achieved perfection, but to be well on our way to a system that prepares all kids for life in an information-driven economy and society that is increasingly diverse. If you take a look at the 5 broad themes, the first is shifting the systems that should be supporting teaching and learning across our community. The second is empowering the people who make the system work, starting with our staff, but moving into our young people as well. The third is creating a sense of community in which all people, especially our young people, feel they can be their best selves. The second is strengthening support in 2 critical areas. And then finally, there is transforming education through what we call deeper learning. So very briefly, to walk you through these building blocks, if you look, kind of read left to right, the shifting systems work begins with modifying funding formulas. That work actually doesn't start until next year, and that's critically important work to think through how we fund and staff our schools. We fund schools in Rochester in a pretty traditional way. X number of kids gets X number of teaching positions. It's one way to do it, but what it means, among other things, is that our schools are funded and structured pretty similarly. But I was in 3 schools today, and 2 of them were elementary schools, Bamber Valley Elementary and Gibbs Elementary, and just those 2 schools are dramatically different from each other, and the third was John Marshall High School. So we're funding in a pretty common way where our student needs are quite different. We also fund pretty much just one teacher to the classroom, which means we don't have many of what we might call, in my world, interventions. We don't have many small group structures. We don't have many one-to-one structures. So for kids who either are ready for acceleration or who need additional support, it's pretty much got to happen within their classroom. And that's a big array of needs to meet in one classroom. So next year, we will start the process of rethinking how we fund and staff our schools for implementation beginning in the 24-25 school year. And the reason that is not kicking in until next year is we want the educational work that I'll mention in a moment to start first, so that the educational vision drives how we rethink our money and our staffing and not the other way around. The next is restructuring school improvement. We have adopted a new approach to helping schools get better at getting better that is focused on a limited number of measurable goals with research-based strategies to achieve those goals and data tools to drill down at the classroom and school level. That seems obvious if you work in the business community. It's not the way the educational world has approached the work that we do. We have a lot of hearts and minds work, and we don't want to leave that behind, but we want to use data and improvement processes. The third is reviewing and revising our policies for equity. Our school board will begin that work next year. We have got a set of policies, like every school district, that tells me what to do and governs the work. And we want to make sure that those are working for the kids and families who face the greatest challenges in our community. And so that's really important work that our board will be leading. Redesigning transportation routes is in the thick of work this year. In fact, literally this week. We have got out of the good decision that predates me to move our high schools and middle schools to a more reasonable start time, the challenge of elementary schools starting at 9:25. 9:25 in the morning doesn't work for little kids who pretty much wake up ready to learn and by late afternoon are not ready to acquire new knowledge in math and science and reading. And it doesn't work for working families who need to be there, especially families who don't have flexibility in their jobs. The problem is we're a 220 plus square mile school district where all of our bus routes are intricately linked, and we don't want to fix the little kids' start times by moving the high school kids back to the crack of dawn. And so we're trying to rethink the very complex structure of our transportation system and not spend more money on yellow school buses. So stay tuned for that one. We are very much in the midst of it. There's other aspects that are in there as well. Next year, we're going to look at increasing the transportation for our low-income families to our early childhood programs. In Rochester, unlike some communities, we actually have very high-quality early childhood programs, so programs for kids who are 2, 3, and 4. And we have available space. Our problem is we can't get the families who need those programs the most from where they live to where our programs are located. And it's very, very expensive right now to move those families on vans, because these are little kids. You can't put them on a big yellow school bus. So next year we're going to begin the thinking about how do we actually increase the transportation support to get our youngest learners to our very high quality programs, because we know that the benefits for kids of high quality early childhood are just off the charts for the rest of their lives. And then finally, increasing philanthropic support. We've been successful in securing a multi-million-dollar grant to partner with higher education to increase the number of social workers we have in our district to meet with work on mental health. We've received a private foundation of $1.2 million to work on deeper learning, but that's, I hope, just the beginning. None of those dollars solve our budget problems, but they can support the change work that we are asking our staff and others to do. When we move up to the empowering people category, that begins with improving recruitment and retention. We have fabulous staff in Rochester Public Schools, but by some measure, the teaching profession is at its lowest point in 50 years in the country in terms of the compensation in real terms that teachers receive, the number of students who in high school and college who want to go into teaching, the job satisfaction of teachers, and the social status that they're assigned. And we need to make sure we are supporting our adults, our education support professionals. That's work that will begin next year. We've begun this year developing our leadership capacity with 13 of our principals going through a 1.5-year-long leadership development program. They actually had their last day yesterday, and 30 more will go through next year. The principalship is key to addressing all of these things, and historically we haven't done much for our school principals. They actually get the job, and they're kind of in it without much support. And we want to take best practices, not just from around the US, but from around the world, and help our school leaders integrate that into what they do for kids every day. Next year, we will launch the Uplifting Youth Voice and Leadership work. And youth voice is related to youth leadership, but different in the way we're defining it. With youth voice, it's making sure kids have meaningful ways to make their opinions and perspectives about our schools known, whether that's through a structured conversation or a focus group or a survey. Youth leadership is helping our kids become leaders, because leaders have followers and actually know how to set goals and get people to work with them and achieve those outcomes and make demands of the people like me who are in positions of authority in respectful but also candid and direct ways. So that's work that'll happen. And then building post-secondary and career pathways. We in Rochester have some wonderful programs that are very focused on preparing kids for life after high school, but candidly we do almost nothing that is systematic for all kids in helping them think about who they want to be, what their skills are, what the job market is going to look like, and what post-secondary education they need to achieve their goals. That has to start at least in middle school, and I would argue in elementary school. We have some kids in our district, many kids, and we're fortunate, whose families are going to make that happen for them, but we have a growing percentage of our district where the families are going to need our support to help their students understand the jobs and the opportunities of the future. One of many reasons I love being in Rochester is, unlike some communities where I've worked, the jobs actually are here. They are in this community. You do not need to leave Rochester to have the extraordinary opportunity of a family-sustaining wage that can advance. I've worked other places where if the school district does a great job, those kids leave the community because the jobs are not there. We don't have that challenge, but we have some heavy lifting to do to get many more of our kids, especially kids who are living in poverty and who are kids of color, on the path to fill those jobs that are very much open in our community. Then we move up into the creating community bucket, and enhancing belonging and behavior has been a big focus. We, like every school district in the country, have seen some challenging student behavior coming out of the pandemic. We have made very clear, shortly after I got here, that there are high expectations for behavior and there are consequences for misbehavior, but we've tried to do that in a very progressive and restorative way that is not punitive, and that is making sure kids have a chance to understand that behavior, reflect on it, that parents and caregivers have an opportunity to be involved. But then, yes, there are consequences, including suspension, but we've also tried to work on belonging so that kids feel that whoever they are, they're welcome and they are wanted, and we know they can succeed in our schools. Next year, we'll launch new work that's in the planning phase now about engaging parents and caregivers. None of our parents kept their good kids at home and sent us the problem ones. They are all sending us the most precious thing in their lives, and we need to engage them in a way that is a two-way dialogue, both about what we need families to do to help kids succeed in school, but us understanding family priorities. I'll just be honest, as Helen mentioned, I started my career as a classroom teacher, and then I've spent the last decade and a half studying education and conducting research. And I can't tell you the number of parent-teacher conferences I've observed in which the teacher never asks the parent a question about their kid of any kind. They talk at the parent for 10 minutes and tell them what's happening in the class and never say, tell me how your son or daughter is doing, about their likes or their struggles. It's just one example of how we need to flip the switch. We'll also launch a program next year to help our parents who want additional support in understanding how to help their kids succeed in school to do so. And that is going to be a parent-to-parent program that allows parents to provide that support to other parents, often in a culturally responsive setting in which parents who are from similar backgrounds can work through a common curriculum together that leads ultimately to helping the parents put those kids on that path to success in post-secondary education or career. And then finally in that category, building out strategic partnerships, both with grassroots organizations, certainly the faith community, and then we have a little hospital in town called the Mayo Clinic that does a lot for us, and I would like to actually take that up quite a few notches, such that we have got an even more systematic partnership with that organization. Second to last category, and I'm almost done, strengthening support. We know from best practice that schools need to have what we call a multi-tiered system of supports, or in my world it gets shortened MTSS. And it's a simple but powerful idea, and it essentially says in any school there should be a pyramid. And roughly 85% of your kids should be able to get their educational needs met in what we call Tier 1, your core curriculum, your core teaching. It needs to be rich, it needs to be challenging. Another 15% actually, or 10%, depending on how you count it, are going to be in those next two tiers. A Tier 2 are kids who can succeed in that core curriculum, in that class, but they need additional support. Maybe they need reading support, maybe they need support from a counselor, a mental health provider. And then there's about 5% of the kids who need to be in different settings, and they're intensive. And that ratio often holds up with striking frequency. When you don't have that in place, one of many consequences is we over-identify kids for special education services. Kids who actually have reading problems or other needs get identified as having a disability, which can have very big consequences for that young person and frankly has huge financial consequences for the district. Next month, we will release the results of a year-long independent review of our multi-tiered systems of support in Rochester Public Schools. And there's some strengths in there in the report to build on, and there's some big gaps that we need to fill. They call out that we do not have the curriculum in literacy that we need in grades 3 to 5. We've made some progress in K to 2, but we're going to be leaning into that very heavily over the year ahead. The second is expanding mental health supports. We know that in the aftermath of the pandemic, by almost every measure, our kids are struggling. Emergency room visits among adolescents for mental health reasons have skyrocketed, and we need to actually make sure that we have increased support for kids both in school and through partnerships. We've just finished another major assessment of our supports, and once again it found some strengths to build on, but it found some gaps. For instance, we don't have what they call screening instruments, usually a short questionnaire, but it also can be an observation that proactively identifies a kid who might be suffering from depression or anxiety. And when you don't have a way to identify that proactively, what happens is it only comes out when the crisis hits and when the kid is really struggling. And so that's another example. And then finally, and I'm going to stop talking here, at the top of that is what we're calling deeper learning. And I mentioned that we had 6 working groups that were working on this plan. One of them was focused on academic outcomes. And when they started that work to make a months-long process oversimplified, they were really talking a lot initially about academic rigor, about more challenge. And as the group looked at more of the research and talked with each other, they frankly got concerned that that risked just being harder, faster, louder, just do more. And they said, that's not what we need. We want kids to actually think better, to fall in love with learning. And so we started to look at some studies of what has been called deeper learning, and the group settled on a simple framework that is a combination of 3 things: mastery, identity, and creativity. And it comes from a professor at Harvard that we've received a grant to be working with, but it's kind of like a 3-legged stool. By mastery, what you're meaning is not covering the curriculum just to get through the textbook or to prepare for the test, but truly ensuring the kid is mastering foundational knowledge and core concepts. It's a less is more approach. But it doesn't stop there. Then the second piece is being very intentional about identity. The kid forms a connection to the content. They begin to see themselves as someone who writes, as someone who likes history, as someone who fixes things, who is artistic and creates things. And then finally, looks like it's telling me to stop talking. And finally, creativity. You're using the learning to solve a problem or to create something. And it's those kind of experiences that probably made school a rewarding place for most of us who had good experiences in school. It's definitely reflective of the kind of knowledge and skills that businesses want our young people to master. And I'm going to end by actually sharing a very random, weird example of the opposite of deeper learning. Here in Rochester, there is a wonderful tradition that I'm participating in of what is called Celebrity Dancing for the Arts. And it's at the Civic Center, and it's in April, and I'm doing it. It is a struggle for me. And the way it works is there's a choreographer, and then there's a dance partner who's a professional dancer. And so this is April 15th, so this is very present in my life. I agreed, sure, I'll do it. I had no idea of how far outside my comfort zone this was going to be. And I was thinking about that framework for deeper learning. And first of all, I should say, this Celebrity Dancing for the Arts is a fundraiser for a good cause. It's not really to teach me to become a dancer. So it's probably not fair to use that framework. But mastery. When I sit there, the choreographer's name is April and my partner's name is Katie, and they tell me, oh, it's just a box. Make the box on the floor. I can't see the box at all. And then they say, make a quarter turn. I have no idea where I do not understand the big picture. I do not get it. And I'm trying. I can't, so mastery, I'm failing completely. Identity. identity is supposed to be helping the kid begin to say, I can write, I can do math, whatever. Every lesson, all I say in my brain is, I can't dance, I can't dance, I can't do this. And then creativity. I probably shouldn't say this because this is on YouTube. One time I tried to make a suggestion of an alternative thing that I thought I could do better. And let's just say I was quickly told that was not the move, and I was not invited to give any creativity in my dancing. So I am experiencing the opposite of deeper learning in this effort. It's still going to be fun, and it's for a good cause. But it is, I have to be honest, as I sit there, I think about kids. I think about kids who go to class, and they, just like I don't understand the box on the floor I'm supposed to do in the foxtrot, they don't understand how you multiply a fraction. And they're not getting it. And I tell myself, I can't do this, I can't do this. That kid sits there, and rather than focusing their intention on the math, they're focusing on the sense that I'm not good enough at this, I can't do it. Maybe acting out to try and avoid being perceived as stupid because I want to pretend that I don't care. And then creativity, feeling like I don't really actually have any say in this. And so that's at the top of our strategies, that idea of deeper learning. And I'm experiencing the opposite of it in that. The final thing I want to end on is back to when I told you about W.B. Pillsbury, that psychologist who talked about education as a sorting mechanism. Part of the reason I started with that was because, as I said, I think that's the vision we want to leave behind. But the other reason is W.B. Pillsbury was a person. Sometimes our educational system, to me at least, having spent my whole career in it in different jobs, can seem so unmovable and so complex that all you can do is tweak a little bit, maybe in your classroom, maybe in your school, maybe in the district. But Pillsbury was one of a handful of people who literally invented the modern American educational system, which actually then went around the world. We were the first country in the world to get all kids to 12 years of compulsory education. And I think that's a hopeful reality. If people then could create the system, we can recreate the system. And I know that may seem audacious to do in a Midwestern school district of 17,500 kids, but I think if you look at this plan, 3 years from now, that should be the beginning of that collective result. It's just a really different system for kids. So it's ambitious, but I think it's achievable, and I'm really honored to have the chance to be here helping to make that journey. And thank you for tolerating that long walkthrough of the plan. I get pretty excited about it. And looks like we're kind of mic'd up again there. You want to give it Helen? And I promise to try and answer any questions or comments in somewhat briefer format than my walk through the plan.
All right. Thank you very much. The first question, and we have a lot of really good questions here, and we'll see how we can get through them, but something that kind of attaches to this whole strategic plan. What about the potential for a referendum? And how will all of this planning require, what kind of funding is that going to require?
One step back, I won't go into a detail, but if you're interested in talking about it, we can. We have a structural budget deficit in Rochester Public Schools that we are taking steps to resolve. We cut $7 million from the budget last year. We're cutting $14 million from the budget this year. That is extremely difficult work that I would never have chosen to do. We are doing it because we've had a structural imbalance in how fast our staff has grown compared to how fast our students have grown, and underfunding from the state. So we're getting our house in order financially. We also have a referendum, which is local revenue generated by local taxpayers, that was approved in 2015 by less than 100 votes, that is $17 million a year. That sunsets in 2025. If the voters of Rochester don't renew that, or if the legislature doesn't give the school board the authority to renew it, which is under consideration now, we would be cutting another $17 million after cutting 23. It would be catastrophic. And so part of my challenge is getting ready to have us have a, I hope, mostly positive, forward-looking vision that people would want to vote for, but candidly also saying that is not what we want for our kids. We have 3 years when we could pass it. Next fall is an opportunity, the following fall, and if we didn't renew it in 2025, we would lose those revenues. I will be recommending to the school board that they put a referendum on the ballot. They have charged me with bringing an option to them for a referendum. I would submit that at minimum, we need to renew that 17 million, which would require no tax increase, simply to renew. I also will say we are not close to the commitment that other communities similar to Rochester make in terms of their local investment in schools when you compare us to other communities that I think are no more education focused than Rochester. So I am hoping we can have a prudent increase beyond just that renewal. But I also have no illusions about the fact that times are tough for some families, and so we need to make sure that if we're asking someone to vote for increased local spending on education, they're confident that those dollars are going to be really well used, and it's going to result in a lot more kids well prepared to occupy those jobs in our community. So they need to vote in August if we're going to put it on the ballot in the fall. And as I say, I'm very confident I'm going to make a recommendation. We'll see what my 7 bosses decide when they get that chance in August.
Good, thank you. One of the things that has come up here with several things is the involvement of parents and families, but also the community. And I know that after or during the pandemic and the shutdown, a lot of volunteers were lost to the school district, and that hasn't come back. How can we, in the community, and I see people here who may not have kids in school anymore, but how can we help through volunteering in the schools?
You're right. We had to pretty much eliminate it for quite a while, and even through almost all of last year, we were saying you can't come in. This year, we've said you can come in, but candidly, it's, for reasons that I think are understandable, been kind of a trickle. I was at Bamber Valley Elementary this morning, though, and they have begun to bring reading buddies back. We're open for business in terms of volunteering. We want people back in our schools. We're eager to have them back in our schools. Starting next fall, as we roll out a new community engagement strategy, we want to be much more intentional about actually recruiting people to be engaged in our schools. But volunteerism is an incredible, incredible opportunity. I think there's 2 areas in which we're super well poised. One is support for reading, and kids who actually are ready to read and who may need some additional support. The second is mentoring, and just filling that relational connection in a kid's life. Relationships are kind of like the active ingredient in education. It's sort of like fluoride in toothpaste. You could brush your teeth all day with toothpaste that doesn't have fluoride, but you're missing that active ingredient. And when a kid has that relationship, that can have just an igniting effect on their desire to be in school. And it's something that mentors from outside the school can really powerfully contribute to. So I'd like to see us doing a lot more mentoring as well.
This is, I guess, a personal question for me, is how does the school best communicate that so that people in the community can know that there are these needs and how they can fill them?
It's a great question. To date in Rochester, and this predates me, but the conversations I've had say our most effective work in terms of volunteering here so far has been through organizations, like through Rotary, or like at Bamber Valley, where I was this morning, they have a long-standing partnership with their Sertoma Club. That's great, but we also know there's a lot of people who aren't a part of any formal organization, and so we need to create easier ways for you to actually go to a website and say, I want a tutor, I want a mentor, I want to read. We are redesigning our website entirely by fall, and we will have easier ways for people to identify. We do need to do a background check on you. We take that very seriously, and so you'll need to pass that background check because we know we need to keep our kids safe. But we've made that quite efficient to get that done. And so we don't have the good open invitation mechanisms that I'd like to have us get, but as I say, we've had some good success working through organizations where it's their members who are coming into our schools.
I have a question here. Test scores have not been moving in the right direction for some time, and so how can we help the schools and the parents working together to make sure that the parents are also helping with this?
I'll be honest, we are having a robust discussion in Rochester Public Schools right now about test scores. For reasons that I understand and have some sympathy for, there has been some perception that standardized tests don't matter, that in fact they're not a valid measure. And it is true. When was the last time any of us took a standardized test as part of your job or just for fun? Not so much. But it is not true that they don't measure anything. They don't measure everything. We will not use standardized tests in Rochester Public Schools, at least as long as I'm here, to evaluate teachers, rank schools, punish anybody, or reward anybody. But they are a good measure of where we need to put our attention and our focus. And they're especially good, and I don't want to get too nerdy here, but standardized tests are highly accurate at both ends of the distribution. A kid who's doing really well on a standardized test is likely to do really well in other work. And a kid who is really struggling on a standardized test is likely to struggle in other areas. Where they get really problematic is in the middle of the distribution. And it's true that for 20 years in American education, we pretended you could set 1 point in the middle and call it proficient, and the kids who were above were good, and the kids who were below were bad. And that was ludicrous, because in fact, it's really a slope. Some of the kids who get this score and they're above it, they're going to struggle, and some of the kids below it are going to do great. But what we do know is when kids are at the extremes, standardized tests are a tool that makes that visible and clear for us. So I like the idea of standardized tests not as a sledgehammer, but as a flashlight. And part of the reason I think a lot of teachers have very complex feelings about them is for 2 decades in this country, we used standardized tests as a sledgehammer, and we really created a disincentive to pay attention to that data because we were literally ranking teachers when there are many factors that determine a kid's test score beyond their classroom. We're not going to do that, but we do want to use them as a vehicle. And then how we raise those test scores is kind of another question, but we're going to use them.
Okay. And where do you see the parent involvement in some of these pieces to help them help the schools in some of these pieces?
In many respects, parent involvement when it comes to the academic outcome piece is uncharted territory. Like, how do you actually help a parent help their kid learn to read? What we do know is that the parent can dramatically influence the kid's desire to take school seriously. Having the mentality of this is an important endeavor, this is a way to reach my goals, my teachers are working in my interest even if they're pushing me and it's not fun. And so I think with our parents and caregivers, helping them help all of our students, especially our kids who are struggling, enter school with the mindset that school really matters to my life outcomes and to my dreams. For some people for whom that sounds like a no-brainer, that may seem silly, but we do have, especially after the pandemic, we have a need to re-engage a lot of our kids in learning, in understanding that school is a means to realize their goals for the future. And why that is very complex. Part of it may have been school became staring at a screen alone in a bedroom for at least 1.5 years, maybe longer, which might seem short to some of us who are a lot older, but for our youngest learners, that was a big chunk of their lives, and it pretty deeply influenced their sense of what school is. So I think with our work with parents and caregivers, it's really that orientation toward school that is something that we need to lean into, and we need to understand that for some of those parents and caregivers, their experience in school was not a good one. And so we can't just sort of assume that they are bringing to the table a positive experience in school that they're going to transfer onto their kids.
We have 2 questions here that are on the same topic and perhaps from 2 sides of the question. And so they involve the schooling and the attitudes towards our LGBTQ plus students. Are they being seen, heard, safe, and accepted? And at the same time, how are we treating them in relationship to some of the faith-based feelings towards these students? So how can we keep that balance between the 2 sides?
I understand why you use the term balance, and there is a certain balance, but I don't think it's a balance in a sense of like we have to just hit the middle ground and not make anybody upset about anything. We don't need balance in saying every kid needs to be who they are in our schools. That is an area in which I'm unapologetically saying we celebrate who our students are, and we create schools in which they can be safe physically and in other ways. I do agree that we absolutely honor parents' priorities for their own children, and that we take that extremely seriously. And so we don't spend time trying to I'll just use a term that I've gotten lots of emails about, indoctrinate kids about things that their own parents might have concerns about. But we also are going to stand up for kids who want to be themselves, whether it is sexual orientation or gender identity. So there's a balance, but it's not a balance of saying, yeah, we'll accept these kids, but not these kids. We're privileged to serve every kid who is in our schools, and we want them to be safe. But we absolutely recognize parents' right to make those decisions for their own children about the kinds of subjects that they're learning about, the kinds of activities they participate in. So in that sense, there is a balance. But by saying that, I hope it's clear. I don't think it's a balance of saying, well, we'll celebrate you, but only so far.
Economically, we have a community that's very diverse and divided in many ways. And so there are two questions that are related to that. And one is, relates a little bit to school boundaries, because we have areas where we have very wealthy people, and we have other areas where there are people who are less economically endowed. And when we are lining up school boundaries, and we know that economics in a family can affect the educational outcomes, how do we develop boundaries that are going to work with a community like ours?
It's a critical question. One of the reasons I was excited about the opportunity to come to Rochester is precisely that extraordinary diversity that we have in our schools socioeconomically. I would say economic inequality is probably one of the top 3 great issues of the day, and it's growing. If we have families that simply can't get by, if you've ever studied any history, you know that over time that is not going to do well for any of us. We also know that parents' first priority is to their own kids. Parents will not send their kids, nor should they, to a school they feel is not meeting their kids' needs. And that can be a tension. And so school boundary designs that kid themselves to believing we can assign families to options that they will not be satisfied with are a recipe for failure, because those families will over time do what they need to do for their kids. So the goal is, of course, to have every one of our schools being the provider of choice for that diverse section of families. When the school district in Rochester redrew the boundaries, which happened before I got here and were implemented this year, they were very attentive to both socioeconomic and racial diversity within the boundaries. So there was a lot of attention to that. That doesn't necessarily guarantee parents will make that choice. And so we have schools that are really dramatically segregated socioeconomically in the way that things work right now. As we think about the future of our boundary structures, it all comes back to transportation routes and where the buses can go relative to where our schools are and where our kids are. Right now, we have a structure in which we have relatively small boundaries for most of our schools and a subset of schools that are what we call district-wide option schools that get busing across the city. That's been long-standing. There's a lot of positives to that system, but there are also good reasons to believe it may be part of the problem with getting our start times where we need. And this is way in the weeds, I know. But when you have bus routes running across an entire almost 220 square mile school district to get kids to a handful of schools because they can be citywide, it dramatically influences everybody else's part of the system. And this is dangerous stuff for a superintendent to talk about, because this is kind of where superintendents go to die, because you start to talk about changing some of these things. So I have to be careful here. I think you could envision a Rochester, and this is just Kent. This is not policy. The school board's never said this. Rather than very relatively small attendance areas for each school and a handful of schools that are citywide, a limited number, I would say 3, of larger regions where you can go to any school in that region you want and we'll give you a bus, because it is much cheaper and more efficient to have lots of buses going short distances across the city than a handful going all across the city. We would need to make sure that those regions, if we ever went in that direction, had the diversity in them so that there's the potential to be bringing kids together across that diversity. That would be a very different kind of structure from what we have right now. I think it might preserve the opportunity for families to have choices and the opportunities for our schools to be very diverse. So that's just one of those things. That's not a next year initiative, but it is something that I think about often as I'm in our schools. This is one of those areas where, for those of you who liked geography when you were little, like, the shape of Rochester matters a lot in this. We're like a big rectangle, and we probably should design. When I was in St. Paul schools, it was all about the river. It was all about where the Mississippi was, because frankly, families didn't want to send their kids across the river for reasons that were just long-standing. Here, we don't have that. So the question would be, if we ever went to a really different kind of chessboard for schools, how would we do it in a way that, as I've said a couple times, balanced choice with the opportunity for socioeconomic and other forms of integration?
A couple more questions that deal with economic diversity and disparities. First of all, we do know that we have a lot of homeless students in our schools, and so how are we able to deal with that, and what do we need to do differently, perhaps?
This is an area in which community partnerships are going to be everything, and I am excited. Olmsted County has been amazing in helping us deal with homelessness. We have first at Riverside, and now we're going to be adding in multiple other schools that serve large populations of low-income families, a homeless navigator whose full-time job and expertise is helping those families find stable housing. And we have, in the schools last year that had our first navigators, we've seen dramatic increases in the number of families who we connected to both interim and more stable housing. So that's one critical piece of it. Another, frankly, is it does cost some money to keep a kid who's homeless in the same school, but there are powerful educational benefits to that. And so we want to be, it's one reason why being efficient with our dollars is so important. If a kid's family is mobile, but they're still going to Gage Elementary, where they have great teachers and they're known, yeah, it costs more in the short term, but it could have big benefits in the long term in lots of different ways. So partnerships to help families find the housing, and then flexible transportation to make sure we can keep kids in their schools as much as possible while their families are dealing with that difficult reality.
Okay, and then related to kids whose families may not be homeless and may not be in what has been, and now with some of the changes, but the affordable or free lunch group of students. I know that we have waivers for fees for athletics and other activities for those who are eligible for that. But there are a lot of families that are just above that cutoff. And our fee structure is really very difficult for families. Do you have any suggestions on how we can deal with the fee issue for students who really need to be involved more?
This is a huge issue, and I'll just say we are right now on the cusp of a really interesting change in Minnesota, because the legislature passed and the governor signed free lunches and breakfast for everybody.
Right.
And that's going to have consequences, of course, for who eats what when, nutrition. It also is going to have consequences for how we measure poverty, because up till now we've measured poverty by how many kids got free and reduced price lunch. There are some different ways of measuring it, like who receives Medicaid in a census tract. That's actually one way. Legislature, when they went to full funding for breakfast and lunch for everybody, decided to hold harmless the money school districts get for low-income kids. So we know next year we're not going to see a plummet in that, but we are watching it because we don't know. Related to that is that we also have used free and reduced price lunch status as the criteria for not paying an athletic fee.
Right.
So we now need to think, what's going to be the mechanism? If I had the money, we would charge no athletic fees for anybody, but we don't have the money. And we have a lot of families in Rochester who can pay and who are happy to pay. And so for us to subsidize sports or arts for families that can pay at a time when we're cutting teachers and in the classroom also doesn't make sense. So we're going to have to come up with another way to do it. There also has always been something of a stigma for a kid to accept a free or reduced price lunch, or to go into the activity director and say, I need the form to play football, but I'm low income. I think we've done a good job of trying to make that as private as possible. But this is a big issue, because for a lot of us, we talked about deeper learning before, and I used the example of how my dancing is not deeper learning, but for a lot of our kids, their best first deeper learning actually doesn't come in the classroom. It comes on a field, or on a dance competition, or in something in the community. And we know that if we stick to the what they call pay-to-play solution, we really are lessening the chance that kids are getting those transformative experiences they get, you know, in a sport or on the dance line. There's a chart that I've used periodically in my former life that shows that school-based extracurriculars, so sports and arts, anything like that, since the 1970s for middle and upper income Americans have been steady. For low income Americans, it looks like this. And it's partly that paying for that. It's also transportation. Because those families, and we have this problem in Rochester, we can give the kid a yellow school bus to get home because we get funding for that from the state. Getting the kid home from practice we don't have funding for. And so the transportation piece is another big obstacle that we have when we think about it. So this is definitely something we're going to be thinking about in the next year, for sure.
Okay. Thank you. School resource officers. This is something that I know you're studying. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the pieces that we're looking at and possible options?
School resource officers are sworn law enforcement officers in Rochester. They're members of the Rochester Police Department. We have 6 of them right now. They mostly work in our middle and high schools, but they're also liaising with our elementary schools. We have a contract with the city of Rochester for those services. We pay half, the city pays half. When I got here, like in many districts, it was the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. There were a lot of complex feelings about police officers, and so we have tried to be very deliberate in taking a look at that issue. We first had a task force that brought community folks together with police, with educators, and we first had a memorandum of understanding, and then we revised our contract with RPD. And there's a lot of stuff in there, but there's 2 big things that happened. One, we said the officers in our schools do not do school discipline. If you have a kid who's acting out in a way that does not have any criminal potential, drug use, violence that could be seriously injurious, theft, your school resource officer is not part of the solution. That's a district staff. Because when you bring a resource officer into that, it greatly elevates the seriousness, and that's not what they're there for. So that's the first thing. The second thing we did, though, is we also put in there, we're really going to help the police in our schools become positive parts of our school communities. And so in the contract, it says they're meeting with kids, they're meeting with families, they're meeting with social workers, equity specialists. So we revised the contract, and we also then had a PhD student at the university look at all the research on SROs, and it was pretty inconclusive in some ways. And I've recommended that we retain SROs in our school district. The board has recently directed me to bring them information on what are alternatives to school resource officers. And there's basically 2 things that we're looking at, and that we'll bring them some information on in May. So this is a fast timetable. One is, rather than having sworn police in your school, you hire your own security staff. You build that. That has happened in Minneapolis, St. Paul, other districts around the country. The second is you essentially have no dedicated security staff, and you have police coming in off the street to provide that security support if an incident happens. And so we're going to take to our board some information on those 2 options. It's interesting because they actually don't have to vote on anything if they want to continue the current system, because the contract with Rochester Police automatically renews if they do nothing. If they want to change it, they would take a vote, and of course, the city of Rochester would have to decide, and certainly Chief Franklin would have to decide if they wanted to respond to that. So this is a complex issue. I have concluded personally that it is in the interest of our district to have those officers there. We have 6 fantastic officers, and I don't say that as someone who approaches this from an ideological perspective. I have never received a single complaint from a student, parent, family, or family member or community member about a specific school resource officer in Rochester in the 1.5 years I've been here. Not one. And I've received complaints about everything else. That doesn't mean it can't happen, and we always have to be vigilant about it. But I have not had it. I would be, if I was hearing that we have biased resource officers, if we have cops throwing kids up against lockers or things like that, I would feel very different. I do not have that experience here in Rochester, but we're always vigilant about it. and need to be. And so that's coming. Stay tuned on that.
I have one related question to that, to add to this, but if any of you have had any additional questions that you've written on a card, you can let Nancy know and she'll bring them down. I've got just a couple here, but we have time. But so the other question related to school resource officers is right now they're in the middle school and high schools, right? Would there ever be consideration for that in any of the elementary schools?
We wouldn't station them probably full-time there because we don't have the need, but we do actually have them regularly go over. They get there fast, and they know every elementary school physically very well. They know the staff, and they know the emergency procedures in every elementary school, and they know what we call the threat assessment procedures in every elementary school. So right now, I have not had requests for heavier SRO presence in our elementaries. They feel that they know the SRO assigned to them well, and they can get there quickly. So at least for the foreseeable future, I think it's really a matter of our secondary schools. But we always keep asking ourselves that question.
Okay, so finally, two related questions. So since you've been in Rochester, let's see, we'll start with the first one first. What are the most negative items you've noted, but then also the most positive items?
The most negative is the budget. I don't want to cut anything, you know, and yet we need to. We need to address the structural imbalance that exists. I don't spend a lot of time asking why that exists because that's past. Every once in a while, it happened to me this morning in schools when people challenge, multiple schools, challenge a particular budget cut. I actually have to restrain myself from sounding like I'm advocating for the cut. It's fair to ask me why I'm recommending that be cut and not this be cut. That's very fair. But I actually have learned to say first, I actually don't want to make this cut. This is not something I'm choosing to do. We have to make that decision. So that would be, that's the negative. It is what it is. It's solvable. It is solvable here. We are not one of these school districts that actually is destined to be in financial freefall in perpetuity. So we have some of that. So that would be, the most positive is the people. The most positive, and I know that sounds like a touchy-feely thing to say, but the caliber of community support for our schools and the educators in our schools and the kids is just unbelievable. We do lack some systems. We lack some systems that can provide some key support educationally and in other ways for the educational process. Our problem is not the caliber and commitment of our community or our people to education. I mean, literally, where else in the country can the fact, honestly, coming up with this graphic made the evening news in Rochester? Like, where else do you have the school district creates a new graphic, and it was a lead on the evening news, which I loved, but they wanted to interview me. I said, you know, all we really did was come up with a new graphic. And they said, no, that's good. People are interested. And so I think it just shows how interested people are in education in the community.
Super. Just bear with me. I have to put my glasses on.
You and me both.
Okay. Okay. Kids who need IEPs are not always getting them done and are falling through the cracks. Can Paris help kids that do have IEPs? And maybe just talk about IEPs and explain the jargon a little bit too.
So when a student is identified as having a disability, which can come in many forms, federal law, which actually originates in the George H.W. Bush administration, requires that we give an individual education plan that identifies how they can succeed educationally with additional supports and modifications that they might need. So every kid has that. In some ways, I wish every kid had an IEP. They get an IEP. Part of the trick, though, is that what you put in an IEP begins to carry, if not the force of law, the weight of a lot of expectation and pressure. And so getting the interventions right, the supports right in an IEP is critical because two things can happen. One, the financial costs can be extraordinary for certain supports. And of course, we're pleased to provide that if it's effective, but if we are taking money from what we call the general fund for all kids to fill in that unfunded piece, it has consequences. So we need to make sure they're very effective. It also can put a kid on a path in which they might have succeeded in that general education curriculum, But because they have an IEP, they are in special education throughout their entire educational career. And we know that that can have some problematic implications for them. So we got to get the IEPs right, and then we got to get the system, back when I was talking a minute ago about that pyramid, we've got to have the supports for kids that are not special education services, but do address kids who are struggling. And that's a really critical piece. Because if we don't have that in place, people identify the kid as having a disability in order to get them services, and that can start that long-term engagement in our special education system that might meet the needs of many kids, but we know from a lot of research is not where a good number of our kids need to be.
So what about the part of paras perhaps being more involved with the IEPs?
Paras or parents?
Paras, I'm sorry.
The-
Which is now the
Like the
there's a
paraprofessionals,
replacement,
yeah,
yes,
we
right.
did. When I got here,
had
we
a
have
new
certain
term.
terms that kind of made me crazy when I got here. We had a group of employees that we called off-schedule and non-schedule. I said, what can you call that? And then the other one was paraprofessionals, because some people thought, does that mean kinda professional? Or so we worked with our union that represents them, and they now are education support professionals, or ESPs. They have a critical role to play in implementing the IEP. Sometimes they're on the IEP team, but they are often that critical support in helping our students make that. And very often they are something that is identified in an IEP. I will tell you that one example of where we need to think hard about our processes is we do have a significant number of kids in Rochester who have been assigned what we call a one-to-one ESP. It's one person who is fully with one kid all the time. That can be an incredibly effective strategy, but for obvious reasons, it's very expensive. And so that's one of the things that we're starting to take a look at, is that one-to-one structure a viable one for us in all of the instances in which it's being used. Our ESPs are amazing people, and so if we had unlimited resources, I would be very enthusiastic about that strategy, but there's a cost effectiveness piece. We spend, every year we take about $15.5 million that is generated in what we call the general fund for all kids to fill the unfunded part of our special education cost, and that's $15 million that is intended to be used for the education of all those kids that is then being diverted to our students with disabilities, which we should do and we're glad to do, but that's a consequence for those kids in the general program.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up.
All right.
And I have just two questions, or a comment, first of all. I'm not sure if any of you have seen, but Dr. Pekel is quite the interviewer in the schools, and he has interviewed students, and among other things, he asked the students, what does a superintendent do all day? And you got some interesting answers, and if you'd like to see it, it's on YouTube. If you go to the school site, you can get the connection to it. But I want to ask you, besides practicing for Dancing with the Stars, what does a superintendent do, especially next week for spring break?
You know, it's interesting because there are superintendents who have school-age children, and I'm sure do a great job both as parents and as superintendents. I don't know how I would be doing it. All of our kids are in college or out of college, and in fact, so for me, this is my social life. You guys are actually it. So I'm kidding. My wife is at home. I'm right now. It's kind of been 24/7 work. I did finally join the Rochester Athletic Club, and unbeknownst to me, everyone who goes to the RAC works for Rochester Public Schools, and I don't know it. And so I get regular critiques on how bad I look when I'm working out in the morning, and that I look like I was going to have a heart attack or something like that. So I try my best to stay in shape, and we have a dog that we like to walk, and we just bought a house and have been in an apartment since I got here in the last year and a half. So the next 2 months are going to be figuring out how to move while I'm doing my day job.
Good, thank you. Well, thank you very much for, let's give Dr. Pekel a hand.
Thank you.
For the help. And we have Nancy Zaworski is going to give us a couple of announcements on upcoming meetings.
Yeah, after our couple of pandemic years, it's really great to see all of you here, so welcome, as well as to those of you who joined us online. We're going to be re-engaging quite a bit now that we can actually start meeting. So if you're interested in any of the issues that we're concerned about with respect to Rochester, you know, affordable housing, social services issues, education, whatnot, reach out to us at inthecityforgood@gmail.com. And also, if you're on our email list already, you know, watch for upcoming meetings, and invite you all to come. And today we have this wonderful forum with Dr. Pekel, but as you know, we have forums about with candidates and about several other issues that come up that are issues for our community. So we invite you to just reach out to us at inthecityforgood@gmail.com. But thank you for coming tonight. And Helen, you can have the closing comments.
Thank you. And again, thank you to you all. Thank you to Christ United Methodist for this. Thank you for Dr. Pekel for coming. And if you have any questions, again, we've got our table out there. We have a QR code up here that you can use to get more information, and talk to any of us afterwards, and we'll be glad to help share. So thank you, and hopefully we don't have snow out there yet, so have a good evening.
There's no kids tomorrow, so if it's a snow day, it doesn't
It doesn't count. That's no fair when it does.
we had a benefit at Mayo High School for our unified program that brings special education students together with regular students, and it was jumping in a pot of bitterly cold water.
Yeah.
And I went and I did it, and the kids were cheering something, and I was hoping they weren't swearing at me or like saying something. And I got out and I asked the assistant principal, what were they chanting? And they were chanting, "Snow day, snow day."
So, well, thank you again, and have a good evening and a safe drive home.